I'm not absolutely certain that I will satisfy all the hopes the speakers who spoke before me will have aroused in you. I will talk about something very fundamental. Conscience and natural law, and I have an author whom I will commend you to read. Human Ethics After the Abolition of God, ? That's the title. And this is the movie that I saw last year. Do you know it? So we have different types of men there. Hardly any women in the decisions, are there? Can't remember. I think it's all men. One who is more or less a sociopath, a friendly one, but he only sees numbers. He doesn't see people. And he knows how to manipulate people and convince people, somehow. Then another guy who doesn't have a conscience. He wants to make money, and he's ready to betray everybody in order to get his advantage. Then there's this guy who has this sort of political conscience. He's fighting against the big, great companies. And then there's this guy whose conscience is very active. And he's troubled. And he wants to know what's going on. They all profit in the course of the movie because of the greed of other people. Conscience, that will be the last point of my speech. Natural law is important to think about if you want to know whether conscience is objective or just subjective. Then with C.S. Lewis, I will explain why the brackets are there, because what he says you could know by other means, and he's no authority. And human ethics after the abolition of God. That's our first round of questioning. Should we decide to abolish God in favor of human ethics? Some people think that. Has science abolished God and/or human ethics? Science meaning, in the Anglo-Saxon context, now natural sciences. Has our culture abolished God and/or human ethics? And can we think about human ethics without thinking of God? First question. Should we decide to abolish God in favor of human ethics? It depends. Yes, you could say, if God is thought to be vicious and cruel. Time, the Greek word is chronos, is a god who eats his children. Saturn in Latin. No, we don't have to abolish God. It's even counterproductive if God is the highest good of mankind. The summum bonum, as the medieval theologians would have said. But the public conception somehow is expressed in this campaign of the atheist group called the Brights. They called themselves so. They have a website, and they try to promote atheism everywhere. So they paid for a bus campaign. There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. That's a very common conception, that if you think too much about God, your life becomes difficult, complicated. You have to worry about things. You can't do what is really, or what would be fun. We have to decide how to think about God to answer the question, is he the summum bonum for me too and for all others, the bonum commune, the common good, or is he not? Has science abolished God and or human ethics? It depends. Some scientists believe this. Other scientists recognize how limited science, understood as natural science, is. Now, this is the famous sociobiologist E.O. Wilson. In his book on human nature, he says, if humankind evolved by Darwinian natural selection, genetic chance, and environmental necessity, no God made the species. This is from the viewpoint of a philosopher and a theologian simply not right, because God could have created a world where evolution is the way for the human being, the species, to develop. But that's his conception. And his friend, who's in the right movement too, Richard Dawkins, draws a conclusion from this. This is one of the hardest lessons for humans to learn. We cannot admit that things might be neither good nor evil, neither cruel nor kind, but simply callous, indifferent to all sufferings, lacking all purpose. So that's his conviction. We've done away with God by explaining how the species came about, and we've done away with ethics. But somehow people stick to ethics, although it's not logical, not scientific. They haven't learned yet. Natural sciences cannot disprove God or the immortal human soul. That's a fact. Normal scientist who doesn't have an atheist agenda or a philosophical agenda would just agree on. So we are doing science, we are not philosophizing, we can't explain what a human being really is, what a soul is, how it comes to exist, and prove or not prove, disprove God. It's just not the subject matter of science. Has our culture abolished God and or human ethics? Ask yourself. Answer it yourself. I don't have to lecture you on that. You are members of the public, members of our culture. Can we think about human ethics without thinking of God? Obviously, you can do that. You don't have to be a philosopher or a theologian to be, or a Christian or a Jew or anything, to act morally. But if you ask, why should I do that? What is behind that? What is the reason? Why does it make sense? These questions, philosophical questions, they tend to need a last cause, a last reason, a fundament that cannot be questioned anymore, that is solid. Now, second point. With C.S. Lewis. Lewis is not an authority, but, and that's the reason why I'm talking about him, he knows what he's talking about, and he argues logically on the ground of common sense. The result being no human ethics is possible without the dogmatic acceptance of what he calls the Tao, what is called natural law normally. Lewis is not an authority, neither like Aristotle or Plato or Socrates, one great philosopher in antiquity, or like a church father for Christian theologians or so. He's lived in the last century. He died on the day when John F. Kennedy was shot. So it's quite recent. And he was an Oxford Don. In literature, he mastered, and in philosophy. And he is not a church authority, at least in a Catholic church, because he was a Protestant, and well, he has not always been a Protestant. He knows what he's talking about because he was an atheist as an answer to the pain he experienced in his youth, and he lost his mother very early. Then he went to a private tutor because he couldn't stand boarding school. And this private tutor was an agnostic, rationalist, and he taught him to think along the lines of philosophical skepticism. And then he developed, when he was 15 or 16, psychological, cultural reductionism, meaning something like this. As to the other question about religion, I was sad to read your letter. That is a letter to his friend in Ireland. He's studying with a private tutor, or maybe already at the university, but he's writing to his old friend, and this old friend tends to be religious. So I was sad to read your letter. You asked me my religious views. You know, I think, that I believe in no religion. There is absolutely no proof for any of them. And from a philosophical standpoint, Christianity is not even the best. All religions, that is, all mythologies, to give them their proper name, are merely man's own invention. Christ as much as Loki, a German god. Primitive man found himself surrounded by all sorts of terrible things he didn't understand. Thunder, pestilence, snakes, etc. What more natural than to suppose that these were animated by evil spirits trying to torture him? These he kept off by cringing to them, singing songs and making sacrifices, etc. Gradually, from being mere nature spirits, these supposed beings were elevated into the more elaborate ideas, such as the old gods. And when man became more refined, he pretended that these spirits were good as well as powerful. So that's how we come to think of the summum bonum and the Almighty. Then he became a Christian because of many different developments in his surroundings, and he was in the war too. But one main point was that he had to teach a class on morality, the foundations of morality. And in 1940, in the Second World War, he lectured for officers of the British Army about the abolition of man. That is a tiny book in English, 3 chapters. The names of the chapters you see there. I really heartily advise you to read this book. I think it's the best essay I've ever read. And there's a collection, an illustration of the Tao in the back, from all different kinds of philosophies and religions throughout the world, showing that there is something common in all the cultures, some rules every culture has somehow found. And he doesn't call that natural philosophy or what did I call it, the natural law, but he calls it the Tao to make clear this isn't a Western thing. It's not just our culture who thinks along these lines. So the argument runs like this. You have a first step, men without chests. What he means is that there is a tendency, even in the 30s of the last century, there was a tendency to give pupils in school and students in university the impression that if you say this is great, this is beautiful, this is good, that's just a subjective impression. It's an emotion. That's nothing scientific, objective, philosophically proven or something. You just, if you stand in front of a waterfall and you say, oh, this is pretty, and another person says, oh, this is inspiring awe. It's great. Then the two descriptions are just descriptions of what's happening in the speaker. And if you realize that, if you say, whenever I say this is good, this is beautiful, or this is pretty, or this is nice, or this is bad, this is ugly, then it's just an expression of what you are feeling towards the thing. You don't want to say the thing really is ugly, or it is really good, or it is really beautiful. Then you end up in subjectivism. Because you will, if you are taught to think that all such value statements are subjective and only in the expression of subjective emotion, you will end up with, if you think about it, with not recognizing any objective value at all. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter is that he explains what he means by the Tao, the way, certain grand rules, like help widows, don't kill the innocent, things like that. Don't lie, don't rob, things like that. So certain grand rules exist everywhere. And if you challenge them by questioning them, why should this be so? Then you lose the ground below your feet. Just take an example. Or I will come to examples, but take one. A girl in the park here near Landstraße Mitte, she is throwing a stone at a bird. I saw it with my own eyes. And the mother said, well, don't do that. And she said, why? Why not kill a bird with a stone? Or throw a stone at a bird? And then if you say, well, because I like birds, the girl could say, well, I want to throw stones at birds. I find it ugly, I want to destroy it. Mother doesn't. So who's right? Well, you have to have a given fundamental law there. You don't have to kill, you are not allowed to kill birds. But we are allowed to kill birds. We eat them. We eat chicken. Chicken are birds. Or dinosaurs or whatever. So, and it goes on. So you can do this with certain moral advice to ask why. Couldn't it be otherwise? But the ground rules, you cannot question. If you do that and you ask for a reason why you should follow the ground rules, then you're stepping out of the Tao and there's no way to prove it. No human ethics, that's the result, without a dogmatic acceptance of the Tao. The third step was that he shows very impressively what will happen, namely the abolition of man. If you say, well, all these ground rules, it's just a matter of education. We could find a new set of ground rules that are very practical and functional for society, but then you could ask yourself, why should it be functional and practical for society? And what is functional and practical for society? And if you go on and think about it, you will end up with something that was described by Max Horkheimer and Theodor W. Adorno in Die Dialektik der Aufklärung, which is a very famous book, very thick, way thicker than this one, and way harder to understand. And Robert Spemann, the famous German philosopher, said, when he found this book in the 50s, he recognized that it was way clearer and not only shorter, but in a classic way, distinct than the dialectic der Aufklärung and earlier. So he found what Horkheimer and Adorno, from the very left side of the spectrum in philosophy, showed to be the dialectic der Aufklärung. You begin with, well, we have this fine, wonderful idea how human beings should be. And we'll educate the coming generations like that. And if you have the means of conditioning them by behavioral psychology to do exactly what your set of values, your new one is, but you don't have a fundamental set of values that cannot be questioned, it's your set of values, then the former generation will be the ruler, the dictators of the next generation. And that's the dialectic Aufklärung. The first thing, well, we've found a critical way to do away with being dictated by former generations, religion, philosophical systems. So we are enlightened. And then they do the same or worse, because they don't stick to an idea they have received by tradition, the Tao. They invent their own set of values. And in the last step, this means, since they don't have a reason for choosing this set of values, nature will win and man will disappear. So that's, in very short, the result. The argument, the result is no human ethics will be there without a dogmatic acceptance of the Tao, which is called natural law. Where does the idea come from? What has it got to do with nature? What is its content? Why does it bind us like all human beings? So it comes from antiquity, Aristotle, Plato, Stoics, Cicero, Roman law. It's not a Catholic or a Jewish invention, or it's not from the Bible. In the Middle Ages, it was received in order to show that Christian faith and philosophy do not disagree. They can be one. Modern jurisprudence is still highly influenced, we have an expert sitting here on this question, by the natural law concept, because the Roman law, which was very influenced by it, it has gone into the BGB, the Bürgerliche Gesetzbuch, in Germany, in England, and the US. It is opposed to the contract theory and positivism. Other cultures have various ways of expressing it. It is not a Jewish or Christian origin, and it is not a religious theory. That's important. What has it got to do with nature? Nothing if nature means nature of natural sciences, how they envision what nature is and question nature. No, there's no spiritual dimension of the human being, no soul in natural sciences. They just don't talk about it. They don't have to deny its existence, but it's not their subject matter. It's not what they mean. No value of the individual or the species. If you ask a biologist or an evolution theory expert, they will tell you that 95% of all the species that ever crowded the Earth have disappeared. And some of them are inclined to speculative thinking in a negative way, meaning that they think about the future. And was it Stephen Hawking, I think, he was warning us recently against robots and computers who will take over, and that sapiens, Homo sapiens, or not really Homo, 2.0 will arrive in 50 years or so. Everything, what has it got to do with nature? Everything, if nature is understood as human nature, meaning Human beings have their own spiritual nature, different from animals. Some actions agree with this spiritual nature and others do not. And there's a grand rule, the primordial conscience, we say, bonum est faciendum, malum est vitandum. That's the Latin expression. Do what is good for human beings, avoid what is bad. What is the content of the natural law? Pretty much the same as in all developed cultures. See C.S. Lewis. If you want to convince yourself, read the illustrations of the Tao, 20 pages there, and there's a German translation here too. And basically, it's what the Ten Commandments say. You remember the sketch we saw in Dr. Röder's presentation. The cultural relativity of moral principles and ethics, which I learned in school, is a modern myth. It's just not true. Of course, there are developments of the ground rules, and there are specifications that differ in the cultures, but the fundamental rules are the same. There's no culture, developed culture, that allows you to kill an innocent. Just doesn't exist. Or that wouldn't respect private ownership and allow everybody to steal or lie or anything. Why does it bind us like all human beings? You could say that it's very good that there's a Tao and that everybody sticks to it, but I don't. I do my part, and as long as the others stick to it, okay. So bonum est faciendum, malum est vitandum. Do what is good for human beings, avoid what is bad. One reason could be because human beings have a right to live a good life, happiness. I think that's a very common answer. The question is, why? Who gave this right? Are we created? No biologist would say that this is the final end evolution is aiming for, the happiness of human beings, because there is no final end in evolution theory. It's a modern myth, not a natural scientist view, that evolution has a direction. It's just philosophy put into evolution theory. Because the human species should survive. Why? Why should it? Because we experience the duty, the obligation. That's what Immanuel Kant would have said. Well, you experience it in yourself. You feel this imperative, categorical imperative, he said. Do as you should do. There's this voice in us. So do as you should do. And what you do and what you think of as the principle of your actions should be capable in potency or potentially be the principle of the action of other people, all other people. Is this an illusion? Relativism or naturalism would say that, or is it a revelation? That's the religious interpretation. A philosopher would maybe just say, well, that's how it is. We experience it, and it is part of our nature. Can you read this? Yeah. Natural law. I'm not saying we should destroy the earth. I'm saying if we do, it won't be sad, since the idea of sadness exists only in the minds of humans. And that's the joke. Philosophers are no longer allowed at environmentalist conferences. So that's the question. Is conscience, you should preserve the earth for future generations. You cannot destroy it just out of egoistical motives. Is that just an illusion, or is conscience a way to reality? Conscience. 4 questions. Does everybody have a conscience? Does everybody's conscience say the same? What is needed in addition to conscience to know what is right? What is needed in addition to conscience to do what is right? There's a practical example, and I brought this paper, Austrian magazine. Can you see what it is? A priest and an ape, and the headline, Was ist moral? Moral. What is morality? I don't know how you interpret this picture. I was kind of insulted at first, being put on a level with an ape, considering my morality. But then they might, if I would know it was profile, they might have wanted to say, see, that's the difference between a human being. There we have an animal, and there we have the ideal form of a moral human being. I'm pretty sure that's not the interpretation the newspaper gave. So let's not talk about priests, but about people working in a great business company.